Implied Consent, EMTs. Sarah and Mike were on a calm shift when their radios crackled to life with a call. Dispatch to all units, we have an unknown medical situation, possible elderly patient in distress. Arriving at a modest, quiet home, they were met by a concerned neighbor who led them inside to find an elderly woman, Mrs. Jenkins, sitting in an armchair by the window. Her gaze was unfocused and her speech was slurred and halting. When Sarah introduced herself and asked how she was feeling, Mrs. Jenkins muttered something unintelligible and then insisted she was fine, refusing any medical help. Sarah and Mike knew that a refusal could only be honored if a patient was fully alert and oriented to person, place, and time. To gently assess her cognitive state, Sarah asked, "Mrs. Jenkins, do you know where you are right now?" The elderly woman looked confused, glancing around the room before muttering, I think I'm at work. The kids will be here soon." Her words trailed off, and she seemed unable to process Sarah's follow-up questions. Mike observed her unsteady movements and drooping facial muscles, classic signs of a potential stroke or neurological issue. Although Mrs. Jenkins kept saying she didn't want to go to the hospital, she was unable to follow basic instructions, and she couldn't understand or repeat the potential consequences of her refusal to seek medical care. Sarah and Mike exchanged a look, knowing that this situation required implied consent. Since Mrs. Jenkins couldn't make an informed decision about her care, they were responsible for acting in her best interest. "Mrs. Jenkins, we're here to make sure you're safe," Sarah said gently. "We're going to take you to the hospital so the doctors can help you feel better." As they prepared her for transport, Mrs. Jenkins seemed momentarily resistant, but soon complied, leaning on Mike as he helped her onto the stretcher. At the hospital. Upon arrival at the hospital, the ER team quickly assessed Mrs. Jenkins and discovered the source of her symptoms. A medication error had caused an adverse reaction mimicking stroke-like symptoms. With adjustments to her medications and careful monitoring overnight, Mrs. Jenkins's symptoms rapidly improved. By the following afternoon, she was alert, oriented, and feeling more like herself. The importance of implied consent. This case highlighted the importance of implied consent in them. Although Mrs. Jenkins initially refused treatment, her confusion and inability to understand the situation indicated she lacked the capacity to make an informed decision. Sarah and Mike's careful decision to transport her under implied consent enabled her to receive prompt medical intervention, ultimately allowing her to return home the next day with her health stabilized and her medications safely adjusted. In EMS, acting under implied consent is a responsibility that EMTs carry with care and empathy. By prioritizing Mrs. Jenkins's well-being, Sarah and Mike made a decision that saved her from further harm and ensured she received the treatment she urgently needed.